I remember turning 7. Do you? The year was 1999. The millennium was half a year away. My friends all had PlayStations and I didn't. My childhood memory is patchy at best sometimes, but if I remember anything, I remember bothering my parents non-stop. I really wanted a PlayStation. One of my school friends would play Abe's Odyssey, another friend would play Parappa the Rapper, another friend would play Spyro the Dragon, and another friend would play... Well, you're really overestimating how many friends I had early on in school. Either way, I wanted it, and I would ask until the end of time for it. Thankfully, I didn't have to, as I was gifted it for my 7th birthday. I had 4 games at first: Tekken, A Bug's Life, one other game I can't remember for some reason, and Rayman. Today I'll be taking you through a journey through time to discuss Rayman, the impact it's had on my life, and the bizarre identity crisis it's gone through over the generations. Welcome to the Recline of Gaming. The following contains spoilers for the Rayman series of games. You have been warned. Ubisoft are a household name these days, aren't they? Back in 1994, I wouldn't say they were a household name. It was far earlier in their life cycle. Although they had already published around 50 plus games at this point, they were still not as big as they are today, having brought out a handful of ports and licensed tie-in games such as Bomberman for Atari ST and DOS, Game Boy games for Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and SNES racing game classic F1 Pole Position. They were yet to make any iconic games that people would remember the name Ubisoft for yet. That very year, Michel Ancel, sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrong buddy, was given the task by the French-Canadian gaming Goliath themselves, having been with the company for a handful of years now. He was originally noticed for his animation talent by the guys in charge. He'd impressed them with a prototype of the original Rayman game, co-produced by Frédéric Oud. Again, sorry for my pronunciation. The prototype was originally just the work of Ancel, targeted for the Atari ST, but when Oud joined, they intended to produce a version for the SNES CD. Originally, the game was very different to the final product as we know it today. The prototype allegedly followed a character called Jimmy, creator of a world known as Here It's Cool on his computer. Here It's Cool becomes infected by a computer virus, leading to Jimmy entering the world he's created to take on the role of Rayman and hopefully save the day. Sadly, the SNES CD as a platform was cancelled by Nintendo, and thus the SNES version of the game had its development halted, in favour of versions that could be played on other CD-centric systems, such as the Atari Jaguar and PlayStation. Having loved the prototype, Michel Guillemot, one of the brothers in charge, decided to make Rayman a key project for Ubisoft, establishing a studio in Montreal to house a team of over 100 staff. This far larger team, including extra animators to further improve the art style of the game, soon brought the title to fruition. It came out in September 1995. In spite of that, Rayman was developed with no arms or legs to keep animation easier. Rayman was the reason I wanted a PlayStation, believe it or not. I remember playing it at a friend's house, and us not knowing how to proceed on the level select map. Yeah. Considering I was supposed to be a smart kid at the time, we couldn't collectively figure out that there was a way to get to the other levels on the map. In spite of this, I wanted the game, and when I got the game, I figured out how I could get farther. The back of the box boasted the game had 60 different levels and 6 amazing worlds, featuring eye-popping animations using 65,000 colours. How could you not be enticed to play this game? It tested my patience and it tested my skills. Having dealt with a lot of platformers previously like Super Mario All-Stars Collection on SNES, Earthworm Jim, Pitfall the Mayan Adventure, and Super Probotector Alien Rebels, I felt trained enough to take it on, but you bet it still challenged me. It kicked my ass over and over to the point where I somewhat gave up, and in the school playground my friend and I found out that one of the lunch ladies had a 100% completion code that we could use to unlock every stage in the game, including the elusive final levels. So recently I've decided to come back and try and beat the game. Myself. No help, no codes, just 100% game completion. My own pain and effort, so I can write about it all for you. So here we go. Rayman, or as the journalists would call it if it were released today, Rayman 1, the Dark Souls of Rayman games. The story has been restructured. The game takes place within a land known as the Valley. Before the events of the game, an orb known as the Great Protoon is keeping the world harmonious and safe. One day, Mr. Dark, a shadowy and mysterious figure, steals the Protoon, scattering its electoons, protons and electrons, around the valley and imprisoning them in cages. It's up to Rayman to set them free, defeat strong foes standing in the way of Mr. Dark, and restore balance to the land. In terms of gameplay, the loop is quite simple, on paper at least, but performing it is not quite so simple. Allow me to explain. The game is a collection and exploration-based platformer, set out in several levels. You unlock further abilities by playing through the game, making previous levels more explorable to further extents. Interesting, since if this was one big world map instead of a set of levels that you can revisit, this could have been an early example of a Metroidvania-style game. You explore the levels, freeing electoons from their cages, collecting tings, staying topped up with power-ups like health bonuses and punch upgrades, and trying to trigger secrets, which in turn would help you collect more cages and extra lives, which look like little Rayman statues. You know once you've found a secret when you hear this little percussive instrument like a weird xylophone being all like... Certain levels are harder at first, but upon revisits, after unlocking extra abilities, you can find them a little easier than before. In fact, the very first area of the game, the Pink Plant Woods, has you start off without an attack at all, so naturally it's worth returning when you learn to punch so you can collect a few bits and bobs. Platforming itself is extra smooth, big thanks in part to the incredibly fluid animations. Combat, however, is a bit more hit or miss, and is very trial and error. Enemies are quick to react, and will often dodge your attacks and cleverly read where you're going sometimes. This wouldn't be so bad, but when you die, which may happen often at first, you will lose your power-ups, and this can take away from the fluidity of the platforming, especially where you have to defeat certain enemies whilst moving quickly to another platform. The game takes place over several uniquely designed worlds, each with its own unique sub-bosses, which teach you some of the boss's habits in advance of taking on the far harder main boss of each section. The worlds are as follows: the Dream Forest, a land inhabited by hostile explorers, dangerous wildlife, unfriendly mosquitoes, and whatever the hell this lippy thing is. Bandland, a place made entirely up of instruments such as drums, trumpets, recorders, cymbals, and its denizens are all musical in nature, except for those bugs. Screw those guys. Blue Mountains, a rather picturesque set of mountains and cliffs filled to the brim with rock people and these weird stalactite things with eyes. Picture City, a bizarre place of inky oceans, walls and floors made of erasers, crafting supplies, pencils and thumbtacks. A lot of the creatures living here are just weird freaks of art. The Caves of Scops, a dimly lit, dangerous volcanic set of tunnels inhabited by sentient rock platforms, the angriest fish, more spiky surfaces than one would care to explore, and a grumpy scorpion. Oh, and finally, after fulfilling specific conditions, you'd unlock the Candy Chateau, the realm where Mr. Dark lives, a town made up of cookies, sweets and frosting, filled to the brim with clowns. It just had to be clowns, didn't it? Send in the clowns! Each of these areas exudes an atmosphere that creates very different feelings and evokes different emotions using varied visuals and audio. Sometimes the music and scenery will create a bouncy and energetic vibe, supported by the incredible musical score, which excites you for what's coming up next, while some of the levels between will have a minimalist percussive feel, with darker backgrounds and themes to fill you with a strange bleakness that you have to push through to make it into the next area. Usually, the deeper you go into the world, the darker the themes can get, such as the flooding level in the Swamps of Forgetfulness, the drum-like area in Part 4 of Bongo Hills where the eyeballs in the stage unforgivingly shoot lightning bolts at you, or Part 2 of Mr. Stone's Peaks, which features a slate tied to two heavy boulders, which is slowly lowering itself towards water, ready to try and drown you. On the subject of drowning, you have a set number of lives and can die by either being hit several times or by falling into or touching one of the several means of instant death throughout the game. The sense of peril is almost always real, even when you feel like you're getting better at the game. A simple mistake can cost you a life, but I wouldn't say it's as bad as, say, certain Mega Man games. It does feel like it can cheapen the experience in places when you have only a limited number of lives, and simply lacking experience in a certain part of the game can have you dying over and over until you figure out what it is you're actually supposed to be doing. To stay alive and progress through the game, you have a myriad of abilities to use. At first, with none, as I'd mentioned earlier, pink plant woods would give you, well, nothing. Well, you do have a weird face-pulling ability, known as the Grimace, that you can use from the start, which when I was a kid I thought it did nothing. Turns out the tall living stones, you know, those guys with the big noses and explorer hats, are frightened of this and will run away, potentially falling into other hazards that'll take care of the enemy for you. These other enemies that shoot weird hammer bullets look rather odd. It's like someone's taken Binky Barnes from Arthur and given him a villain mustache. Not that you'll use the Grimace very often or for long, I imagine, since you do unlock the second power fairly quickly, the telescopic fist, commonly known as the punch. The fist is the only reliable method of attack you'll be using for sure. It can harm most enemies conditionally, and depending on length of time charged or even Rayman's momentum, you can affect the distance and strength of the punches. The fist can be upgraded, both in speed and in hardness, by picking up the Speed Fist power-up and Gold Fist power-up respectively, or should I say, Goldfish. That doesn't look like a hand. Eventually, this can be upgraded to allow Rayman to grab extra lives from a distance, or swing from grab hoops. Rayman also gets the ability to hang. No, not that way, that's a bit morbid. He can hang from ledges. Before he couldn't climb very well, but at least now he can hold onto the edge of stuff, then jump up. Eventually, Rayman gets an iconic upgrade, and one that I'm certain has been nabbed from Earthworm Jim. Nonetheless, Rayman gets a helicopter head. Imagine being able to spin your hair so fast you can hover. All I can do is imagine having hair. This becomes integral to certain exploration and platforming segments in the game. Timing when to glide across with your hover hair is important. The final permanent power Rayman gets is the ability to run. Up until this point, the game was teaching you how to play, so I suppose you could say that the game had to let you walk before it let you run, although you also had to be able to fist before you could run as well, so I'm not sure what kind of message this game's trying to convey. Right, moving on, the run ability is actually one of my favourite in the game. Not only does it up the pace of everything, making exploring previous levels quicker, but because of the previously mentioned smooth animations, it adds an extra degree of fluidity and motion that keeps the game fresh. A few levels grant access to less permanent powers, such as the super helicopter, which allows you to fly for the whole level. Some of these levels, might I add, are some of the most stressful. Another temporary power is the blue elves that make you shrink, although I'd say most of the time the blue elves are a pain in the arse, and aren't a power per se. Touch one at the wrong time and you'll be too small to run from an enemy, or too large to land on a ledge and you'll potentially fall and die. Either way, I hate these blue elves. I have both songs of praise and words of detest for this game, all for good reasons. When you've got a good grasp of the game, you can appreciate it for what it is, a beautifully animated game with a wonderful soundtrack and challenging gameplay. But the challenging gameplay is also part of the issue. A lot of the replayability is forced by mandatory completion of an area if you want to find any of the missing cages. Even if it's one cage in the middle of a handful of levels you're doing, you'll have to complete the whole cluster to register that bit, meaning potentially going through some more unsavoury areas, especially in Bandland, where some of the levels are made up of 4 or more stages, or Picture City, where some of the stages just feel stupidly difficult in succession. Momentum feels wonderful in the game sometimes, but it can often be your worst enemy, leading you into a trap caused by the constant drive you feel to move on freely. You've got to remember whilst playing that this isn't a platformer about going fast, it's a platformer about patience, trial and error, and learning level behaviours and patterns. Rushing will kill you. Between each of the major worlds is a hike in difficulty. At first it's not so bad. Jumping from a dream forest to the Badlands, you get a pleasant spike in difficulty. Just before you unlock the helicopter power-up, the game gets a bit tough on the low friction platforming segments, only what I can describe as a very well disguised ice level introduced to my first handful of repeated deaths upon my return to this game. My years of muscle memory hadn't trained me for the Allegro Presto levels. From there, going into Blue Mountain feels a bit harsh, but the levels still feel doable. Some significant unfair traps and ambushes take place in which things will blink into existence to cause you trouble. Enemies need more punches to take down, even with full power-ups going on, and they will throw unnecessary amounts of projectiles at you to give you the platforming micromanaging session of your life. The next hike in difficulty is the one that causes me the most frustration. Although you've just been rewarded with the run power-up by here, you have to deal with janky platforming, instant death scenarios, and frustrating levels of backtracking to find certain cages. This is the only point in the game I found myself saying, right, time to replay some of the other levels to get extra lives and cages that I couldn't get before. Picture City is where the real Rayman begins. Overall, this places some of the worst challenges in the game. These thumbtacks are a complete pain, pun may be intended, and fighting each iteration of Space Mama grinds my gears as well. The Caves of Scops is truly a challenging area. Thankfully, the music is really funky. I feel that the challenge here is far fairer than that of Picture City. It feels like a combo of everything we've learned until now, amalgamated into a really decent area. A lot of the secrets are shown to you easily, but getting to them becomes a challenge, rather than trying to figure out how to make them appear. Eat at Joe's? Who's Joe? Joe Mama? Jokes aside, more funky music and a fun area ahead. Joe is a space alien and introduces a gimmick that's quite common in PS1 platformers, the "you're the only light in the dark area" gimmick. Coolly, the light follows Rayman's fist, so you can send it ahead as a guide instead of blindly jumping into darkness. This seems to be a mini quest almost to get the power at Joe's cafe switched back on. Turning on the power activates these automatic UFO segments, which might I add include some of the hardest but fair moments in the game, relying on your reflexes a lot but not without reason. Once you're back at Joe's, you can get along the river-like thing, where you can hop onto these buoys, however you pronounce them, and hop along to fight Mr. Scops himself. Did anyone else notice that Joe has a poster of a real human woman in a swimsuit? Oh Joe, you old rascal. Anyway, Mr. Scops is not an easy fight. It's a two-parter, and in both parts, you technically do no attacking. Also, I like how he's a scorpion, and yet he's called Mr. Scops, and not just Scops. Is there a Mrs. Scops? In part 1, you have to run away from attacks and hang on ledges and run to the next area when the lava starts to rise. Nice and simple. In part 2, you just have to dodge attacks and make Mr. Scops sting himself. Easier said than done, as a sting attack follows you way too closely and doesn't hit himself very easily. He has way more knockback than any other boss as well, and there's not really a possible way to just hit him yourself. Honestly, Scops looks like he's given himself peace. He's smiling. A lot of the boss fights in this game become more patterned and routine as the game goes along, making the fights less freeform and more about following a schedule or script. This gives off huge Super Meat Boy vibes for anyone who has had to deal with the boss levels in that game, only difference being that you can fight back to a degree. The major elephant in the room for this game is that the game, whilst difficult to get through, is even harder to complete properly. To face the final boss, you're required to free 100% of your Electoons. That's right, each hidden cage, every backtrack, each bizarre secret you've got to overcome, you've got to do if you want to reach the real endgame, Candy Chateau, along with the final area of the game, Mr. Dark's Dare. Was it worth it? I'd say, hell yes. This final area is certainly a fun, not as challenging as the previous areas, but still uniquely challenging in their own way. The Spoon Ride level, the Bad Rayman stage where you have to make it all through the level without touching the evil version of yourself, and if you've played the Atari Jaguar version, Bad Rayman wasn't included, kind of anticlimactic really, and the Curse stage where Mr. Dark will put weird spells in you, affecting the level controls such as reversing your directional input or forcing you to run in one direction. Everything you've learned up until this point makes this level more than doable, just a little frustrating at times. Then finally, this is it. The battle with the head honcho, Mr. Dark himself. Rayman takes every opportunity as you stand still to look frightened and bite his nails. This acts almost like a pseudo-boss rush mode in a weird way, where you have to fight obscure hybrids of all the bosses you fought before with dangerous combined abilities to test your skills for the final time. Exciting music plays off as you fight off the freaks of nature made up of the foes you've struggled with on the way here. This fight feels a lot easier than the last few bosses you fight, or maybe our skills we've gained along the way has made it feel that way, but after a short challenge you finally manage to save the day. My verdict? I give this game 7.5 recliners out of 10. I am admittedly biased, as, you know, this was my first ever game on the PlayStation, and I've played through it plenty of times in my youth. Having returned to it, however, has stressed me out to no end, and I've had a tough time of it, but the game is an aesthetically pleasing experience, both visually and audibly, and whilst the challenge is not necessarily a fair one, there's a cathartic feeling to overcoming the patterns, remembering the paths taken to avoid harm, and discovering the vague secrets the game has to offer, even if it means replaying through some of the worst levels a few times. I believe there are a few improvements that can be made to the game to make it more of a definitive experience, and that's where Rayman Redemption comes in. Rayman Redemption is a fan game released in June 2020, made in Game Maker Studio 2, also containing Redesigner, a level editor made for the fan game. The game was made by user Ryemanni and can be accessed on the website GameJolt. I'll be linking the project in the description of the video. The project was in development for years. As I can see some of the development diaries on this website it is hosted on are as old as 3 years, as of the making of this retrospective. The game is, from what I've gathered, a complete remake of Rayman 1 in the Game Maker Studio 2 engine, reusing a lot of original Rayman 1 assets, including cut ones, filled with references and nods to other games in the Rayman franchise, along with additional levels and content created by Ryemanni. Not just a complete remake, but a well thought through rebalancing of the game, made by someone who has clearly a lot of passion for the game through a lot of hard work. I have so many words of praise for this project that I'm not sure where to start. The game is in widescreen HD, allowing for a much larger amount to be viewed on screen at once. There's a myriad of controller, sound, and visual settings available to customize the experience heavily, and that's just the stuff I've noticed before starting the game. Upon starting a new game, you realise that you've access to all of Rayman's unlockable abilities from the original game. This poses an important question. Won't this ruin the balance of the earlier stages? The answer would be no. It had been apt to have called this game Rayman Remix, as a lot of the levels have been shuffled around, adjusted, and creatively reworked to create what feels like an almost new game entirely. It adds a challenge for experienced Rayman players, as there's a lot of content that isn't the same as before. Bosses have extra move cycles included with their regular attacks. A lot of odd, out-of-place enemies have been given a place as mini-bosses with their own unique attack patterns. That weird lippy thing I mentioned earlier before, a mini-boss. That really cool obstacle enemy in Badlands is now also a mini-boss. And there are new enemies in the game themed around this character to add more depth and flavour to the universe. The game has also been adjusted to be more fair. Larger health power-ups stack, you can upgrade your maximum health through collecting cages. Tings can be spent on upgrades and power-ups to make the game more of a personalised experience, and also to incentivise the collection of Tings further past collecting additional lives. The Ting shop also offers extra costumes and other aesthetic choices to make the game that much more customisable. Also, it's yours, my friend, as long as you have enough Tings. Back on track, the game may be notably easier now, sure, but it gives a perfect level of challenge for new players to the series, as well as making things super fresh and manageable for people who played Rayman growing up, but couldn't handle its harsh difficulty curve. Still scared that it will be too easy following these adjustments as a more adept player of games? Then pick a harder difficulty option, as there have been several levels of difficulty added, along with a casual difficulty that removes the need for extra lives to begin with. Rayman Redemption has truly been crafted with a myriad of audiences in mind, both old and new, both casual and hardcore. The mosquito segment in the forest is now a side-on shoot-em-up section, rather than just obstacle dodging, in what feels like a nod to the mosquito segments in Rayman Origins and Legends, and they added in extra mosquito levels for later in the game for people who enjoyed those sections. NPCs now have dialogue, which appears to have been voiced in a method I can only compare to the vocal stylings of Banjo-Kazooie. I'd love to detail every change, big or small, that has been made for this remake, but it'd take me quite some time to go over everything in its entirety. Instead, as a fan of Rayman 1 and as an enthusiastic enjoyer of gaming overall, I'd suggest going out of your way to download this free-to-play fan game. If Rayman had been like this from the start, it may have had more of a cultural impact than it already has now. I'd have given this game 9 recliners out of 10 instead. Big thanks to Ryemanni for putting in the time to make such a pleasant homage to a huge part of my childhood. I shan't be going straight into my analysis of the rest of the Rayman franchise yet. I feel I had enough words for Rayman 1 and Redemption to fill out enough time, but I guarantee I will be giving my 2 cents on the rest of the games in the franchise. After all, one key detail that brought me to write this piece to begin with was the Rayman series had a blatant identity crisis. Having explored the early development of this game and seeing how much it had changed between its conception to the demo to the final product is evidence of that, but only the first piece of evidence. Rayman 2, 3, the Raving Rabbids spin-offs, Rayman Origins and Legends are games that have all retconned or changed certain events in the Rayman series, so that details are contradictory or are even overwritten entirely. I've asked around for some thoughts of the original Rayman. People I know have echoed a few sentiments. A lot of my childhood was spent playing that game, had been said a few times. It was fun, but I didn't make it through the game due to difficulty was a common one. And somehow, more commonly, a lot of people came in either saying they'd only ever played Rayman 2 or that they preferred Rayman 2 significantly. We will find out why, potentially, next time on the Recline of Gaming.